What is going on, guys? This is Earpugs, and today we are going to be doing a Season 9 tier list for Cataclysm PvP. This is going to be specifically focused on Season 9, not covering the other seasons, just because that's the one that I have the most amount of experience with. So, to start it off, we're just going to get right into it. We have Affliction Lock. Now, Affliction Lock actually has a lot of different changes that go from Wrath of the Lich King into Cataclysm. The biggest changes that Affliction Lock gets is that you're actually going to use Curse of Agony now as a part of your damage rotation, because they change it from a curse to a quote-unquote bane. The core playstyle is still the same. You're going to be using, your dots with Unstable Affliction. You're going to be dotting everything, usually multi-dotting. You do pick up a great ability called Soul Swap, which allows you to completely take off an entire rack of dots off one target and then put it to another one, which is really awesome. Allows you to get WAs out with only getting one UA cast. Some of the problems that you'll run into with Affliction Lock are the same things that you would run into with Wrath of the Lich King. They are pretty squishy. You do still have Portal. You do still have Healthstone. And a nice thing now that they added is that you have your Soul Shards being a different system completely, where you can regain them throughout the game, as well as Feldom only being a 45-second cooldown. Affliction Lock has a ton of different compositions that you could play with it. It is a very versatile spec, seeing as you're always going to add Fear, Curse of Tongues, Curse of Exhaustion, tons of blanket damage, as well as having double CS with Feldom. So you can complement a ton of different comps. Some of these super strong comps that you're going to see from Affliction Lock are going to be MLS, you're going to have RLS, of course, and then you can even see a bunch of hybrids like Shadow Cleave is very strong in Season 9. Overall, Affliction is just a super solid spec. Since this is a Season 9 tier list, I'm actually going to put Affliction in A. Later on in the expansion, Affliction definitely goes into S, but as far as Season 9 goes, it goes into A just because melees have so much damage and you are pretty squishy, and Arshams haven't scaled yet as much as they will. So, while Affliction is an insane spec in Season 9, I would not put it into S just because it has a few glaring negatives. But overall, super strong spec, very capable. Moving on to the next specialization of Warlock, we have Demonology. While Demonology is not one of the top tier specs, it is not an absolute bottom tier spec because you can actually kill things, especially in Season 9. I would actually say that it has the same role as it does in Wrath, seeing as you have your big go for 30 seconds with Metamorphosis, and then outside of Metamorphosis, you are just a worse version of Unstable Affliction, and I would probably even put Destro maybe slightly above it. However, Destro is significantly nerfed compared to Wrath. Demonology will go into C tier just because you can make it work in some very niche comps, and it does have an all-in effect to it, just like it does in Wrath of the Lich King. Since this is a Season 9 tier list, it's going to go into C. If it was any later, it would definitely go into D, just because people have low health pools, and you can kind of one-shot healers, especially Arshams. Moving on to Destruction, this actually gets significantly nerfed going into Cataclysm, and unfortunately, it does take it down quite a few pegs. Your Chaos Bolt does not hit for big numbers like it used to. You do still have Shadow Fury, and your gameplay is very similar to how it was before, utilizing your Immolate, etc. But since Cataclysm isn't nearly as bursty as it is in Wrath, especially Destruction, this is really not that bursty at all, you kind of are just a way worse version of UA, because you don't have that snap damage that you need like you would have had in Wrath of the Lich King. So, with that being said, Destro is going to go into C tier above Demo. You could maybe make an argument for B, but overall it's just not, UA is so much better than Destro, it's not even, comparable. Like you could play Destro in niche comps, and just, for fun or whatever, and, maybe if you were a god, you could, go to the top of the ladder with it if you were just the best player ever, but UA is just so much better than Destro. I can't wholeheartedly put it above C, because that's where it should be. Up next, we are moving on to the Magister. Starting it off with a very iconic specialization, we have the Frost Mage. Now, this is a very interesting specialization, because Frost in Cataclysm has a ton of burst damage, some of the highest burst damage in the entire game, seeing as how they reworked it, so now that your Ice Lance absolutely cranks people. However, it does not have sustained damage as much. So for RMP, I do believe that Frost would probably be better. I don't have extensive play as RMP yet. I will once Cata actually comes out, and I will be testing Fire versus Frost to see what I like better. However, with the amount of experience that I do have playing this, which is a decent amount, Frost has huge burst damage. It's very similar to how it was in Wrath in terms of, like, if you line up a go and then you set up a Shatter with all your procs, like, you're going to, like, two-shot somebody, you know, especially if you have a rogue that dances on that at the same time. You could also play with a Feral. Bunch of different stuff can play with Frost. I will say that Frost, I don't actually know if it's better or worse than Fire, because they're both really good. Like, they're both really strong. I think Frost is overall a little harder than Fire, because Fire is simply a, you know, you can, like, tab Living Bomb, Pyro Proc, send the damage, DB, you know, ring. Like, there's, like, a lot of easy, like, Fire is much easier. But that doesn't mean that Frost is bad or worse than Fire, just because Fire is easier to play. You do have a permanent Water Elemental now as a Frost Mage, as opposed to Wrath of the Lich King. Your Shatters do a shitload of damage. You still have Deep Freeze. However, you're usually going to be using Deep as a, you know, just like you would in Wrath, you would Deep an off target, etc., etc. Frost is going to go into A for Season 9 for sure. It's really strong. I have actually gotten one shot by Frost Mages before. Like, if you're half health and you eat a Shatter, like, you could just die. As far as the compositions that you can play with Frost, they are very similar to Wrath. So, you know, you have RMP, you could play FMP, as I mentioned previously. You could probably play MLS too, TBH, but I think Fire MLS would probably be a little better, but maybe it's comp dependent. So, really, you could play this with a lot of stuff, but anything that has a high amount of damage, like, you could probably even play DK. I bet you DK Frost would slap. If you go on healers, like, there's probably a bunch of different comps you could play, because DKs are pretty insane S9. So, Frost goes into A. Very, very strong. Very, very strong, of course. Alrighty, moving on to the Fire Mage. Now, the Fire Mage actually goes up quite a few notches in Cataclysm for a multitude of reasons. Some of those reasons being that healers no longer have as much raw healing as they did in Wrath of the Lich King. On top of that, since they don't have as much raw healing, when you have a bunch of spread damage, it's harder to keep your team alive into that. And that, obviously, is just from the healer perspective. That has nothing to do with the Fire Mage in terms of changes to Fire. That is simply the way that healing in Cata is changed, so therefore Fire becomes stronger because of that. Of course, Fire has Dragon's Breath, which is an absolutely absurd ability. You can get an entire team if they're all stacked up on a pillar, and then you can simply DB them all, and Dragon's Breath does not break on any kind of dot damage, so if you're playing a comp like Fire Mage with a UA lock, or Fire Mage with a DK, or Fire Mage with a Feral, and everything is bled and dotted and diseased, and then you simply DB the planet, you can actually literally almost kill people with Dragon's Breath, and on top of that, it's a super short cooldown, and it is a full 5-second duration. All of those things make Fire a super, super, super strong spec. Since this is a Season 9 tier list, I don't know that you could put Fire in S, because if you were to put Fire in S, that would mean that, like, it's, like, so god tier. But it definitely would go into the top of A. It is extremely versatile. If this was Season 10 plus, then you're moving all three of these specs into S, most likely, but I'll know that once I play it. Since it's Season 9, you are still a caster. Fire Mages take tons of damage. Of course, you have Blazing Speed, and you now have Cauterize, which is a very nice ability, but you are still very squishy, and you are on one ice block. So if your healer gets CC'd, and you're a Fire Mage, you take a bunch of damage, you get Cauterized, usually you're going to get them both. So you're going to get Cauterized, and you're going to get Block, and then the next go kills you just about every time. Fire Mage can play with an absolute ton of classes. I would argue that Fire is more versatile than Frost is in terms of the comps that you can play, just because you have so much damage, and with the addition of Ring of Frost, which I failed to mention already, sorry. Ring of Frost is a huge ability, puts a ring down, it's a 2-minute CD, and anybody who walks into the ring is going to get actually frozen, just like Hungering Cold. It's basically an AoE Hungering Cold on the ground. That's what Ring of Frost is. And it's very common that you'll see a Fire Mage use Dragon's Breath into a Ring of Frost, as well as using it to peel, offensive, defensive, has a ton of utility, and it complements fire immensely because your dots will not break the ring. Moving on to Arcane. Now, I'm going to be honest, I actually don't think I've played against it a single time. To my knowledge, it is significantly worse than it was in Wrath, and in Wrath, with the 3.3.5 patch, it actually was like, you know, low B tier in Wrath, and it's worse than it is in Wrath. So, I literally haven't seen it. I'm going to put Arcane in D. Maybe if you're a god, you could make it work. Maybe there's some unknown build that I don't know about. I just don't have enough experience to speak on this spec, seeing as I literally don't even see it. I know it's not as good as it was in Wrath, and in Wrath it wasn't even a super high tier. Moving on to an absolute titan of WoW PvP, we are of course talking about the Arms Warrior. This spec was the strongest melee in the game for Wrath of the Lich King, hands down 10-1, it wasn't even close, and you have seen an absolutely crater from where it was in Wrath of the Lich King to Cataclysm for a multitude of reasons. For anybody who doesn't know, Warrior was insane on Cataclysm launch when they actually launched it, and they nerfed it into the absolute ground from there. We are, of course, going to be playing on the final patch of Cataclysm at the moment, is what Blizzard says, so therefore we're going to be playing with the final version of Warrior. Now, I don't want to talk too poorly about Warrior, because it's not a terrible spec. It is certainly viable. However, it is not nearly as strong as it was. You now get Throwdown, which is a 45-second cooldown, and it is a 5-second stun. You do also pick up Gag Order off of your ticks, which is a 3-second flat silence, just like Prot had in Wrath of the Lich King. You also get that off your Heroic Throw. On top of that, you also have Charge, of course, and then Intimidating Shout. So you have a total of 5 cast breaks plus, depending on the situation. You are still doing a lot of damage. Another thing is that Mortal Strike has been completely changed in Cataclysm in terms of its effectiveness. Not only is it a 25%, but you now also don't have Unrelenting Assault. For anybody who doesn't know, warriors that were arms in Wrath of the Lich King had 75% healing reduction if they overpowered you on your cast. Not only is their MS that used to be 50 now 25, but that no longer exists as well. They still do a ton of damage. They do pick up Heroic Leap now, so they have a 1-minute leap across the arena ability. They are very mobile, still having Intervene in their charge, etc., etc. But they do not have as much survivability as they did, seeing as Second Wind and Blood Craze are fairly nerfed compared to how they were in Wrath of the Lich King. Overall, Arms Warrior still remains viable, of course. However, it is quite a fall from grace compared to how it was in Wrath of the Lich King. All of these different changes put Warrior into the B tier. You can still play all your melee cleaves with Warrior. You can still play all your other comps with Warrior. However, there is now a lot stronger melees than Warrior. Moving on to Fury, I actually have not even seen a single Warrior as Fury. Fury was awful in Wrath for PvP. I'm sure it's the same for Cata. That's that. Moving on to Prot, same situation with Fury. I have not actually seen any Prots. They do not seem to be that good, and it goes into D for that reason. And now we are moving on to an extremely iconic specialization and class. We are, of course, talking about the Subtlety Rogue. Now, sub-rogues in Cataclysm get a huge swath of buffs with Smoke Bomb, Recuperate, Combat Readiness, all kinds of different abilities that make them not only have better survivability, but also have tons and tons of control, and then on top of all of that, they have a ton of damage. So, Subtlety Rogue becomes a class where you have the best of all 3 worlds. If you look at Sub-Rogue and Wrath of the Lich King, it has really high burst damage, a ton of control, but it's squishy and can die fairly easily. This changes a significant amount in Cataclysm, taking their 3rd weakness in Wrath of the Lich King, which being squishy, and completely removing it. I would not say they're the tankiest class in the game, but they certainly can live for a very long time. You are still a rogue, just like Wrath, so you have Sap, you have Blind, you have Cheap Shot, you have Kidney. Of course, a big change they made now, Cheap Shot and Kidney Shot now DR each other. So if you're going to try to Kidney a target and then cheap it out, the cheap is going to be DR. You still have Dance, you still do Goes, but you can gas pedal a lot more in this expansion than you could in previous expansions. Since this is a Season 9 tier list, it is pretty difficult for me to place Sub-Rogue in between A and S. Sub-Rogue is certainly closer to S than it is to A, just because their toolkit is so insane. If this was a Season 11 tier list, then I would make the argument that Sub-Rogue is the best class in the game, being at number 1 out of 1, since they have Legendary Daggers and Trinket, as well as their damage scaling very heavily, and on top of all of their giant utility and list of buffs that they got. Even in S9, I would put them at the bottom of S. They have a ton of damage, ton of control, ton of survivability, ton of utility, overall insane spec, very strong. The comps that you could play with Subtlety Rogue are endless. You could literally put a Rogue in almost any comp that a melee would take the spot in, and it's going to be strong. You, of course, have your signatures like RMP, and then in Cataclysm, RLS becomes very strong. But there's tons of other stuff you could play. You could play Shadow Priest Rogue Arsham, you could play Rogue DK, you could play tons and tons of comps. Subtlety Rogue is a super strong specialization. Alright, moving on to the next two specs. I actually don't know very much about these two specs. I just know that absolutely nobody plays them, so therefore I'm just going to put them in D because I literally haven't even played against them. Maybe there's some god tier player who can play these to rank 1. I have just never seen anybody even play them. Sub is obviously significantly better than both of these by a landslide. Up next, we have Boomkin. Now, Boomkin actually becomes pretty decent in Cataclysm as opposed to Wrath of the Lich King. The famous thing that they pick up is their Solar Beam. Solar Beam is a 1-minute CD, and that allows you to put a beam of light on the ground, which you can then root somebody in, which is really strong, seeing as they are not going to be able to escape, and it will last the entire duration of that silence. It also interrupts people if you catch them on a cast. You still have Starfall. You still do a ton of damage when you pop Starfall. Most of the time that you're going to be killing something is in, you guessed it, Starfall. So it is kind of a one-dimensional spec still, because when you have Starfall, you can win the game, and when you don't, you could still win, but it's going to be difficult. You do get trained a lot. You don't have as much survivability as other classes, seeing as you don't have an ice block, you don't have a portal. You do have Bark Skin, of course, you do have Bear Form, and Bear Form is buffed in Cata, so you are a little bit better. Keep in mind, chat, since this is a Season 9 tier list, this is for Season 9, if you can believe it. It is not for Season 10 and 11. I bet you would see Boomkin in A tier if you were to be, this was to be a Season 11 tier list because it's going to slap. But since this is a Season 9 tier list, I'm going to put it at the top of B because it is viable and it can work, but it has some glaring problems, just like Arms Warrior does. Up next, we have a very strong specialization. In Season 9 Cataclysm, Feral Druids are ridiculously strong. They have sustained damage with their bleeds. They have huge spike damage with Ferocious Bite as well as their cooldowns. They have a ton of control with Cyclone and Predator Swiftness. Another huge change that happens going from Wrath to Cataclysm is that all the healers who would normally be spam purging are restricted to 1 buff to purge. This is a big deal because now, when you're trying to purge a Feral, if they have, let's say, Power Word Fortitude, Shadow Protection, Shield, Renew, Grace, they have all these buffs on them, and you're trying to purge off the Predator Swiftness, it makes it very difficult. And on top of that fact that I just mentioned, healers have no spell haste, and purge is very expensive. So it is a triple negative to try to purge a Druid clean. While you should be doing it, it just makes it overall much harder. Another huge problem that Ferals had in Wrath of the Lich King is that they were very squishy and they would die very easily in a lot of situations, especially to casters. Since they made changes to Bear Form, where you are much tankier in Bear Form, Ferals are now very strong at living, as well as dealing damage and providing utility. One of the only negatives that Ferals have going into Cataclysm is that they can no longer shift out of a route. However, they can still shift slows. With the changes going into Cataclysm, Feral Druids are now much tankier and can survive a whole plethora of comps that they used to just simply die to. Predator Swiftness getting a buff inadvertently by making the Purge change and slowing down healers' globals, making it very hard to purge. And them also retaining a ton of their damage while also having Mortal Strike being nerfed. Lastly, another huge change that they have is Ferals now have a kick. You have a short range kick. It is up to 13 yards, if I'm not mistaken. So you can off-kick a close target. You can kick somebody who's right in front of you, which was always one of their glaring negatives. Stuns are also 5 seconds now. So your maim that used to be 3.5 on certain healers and certain classes is now 5, 24/7, as well as bash. All of these changes make Feral Druid so good. And in Season 9, before Legendary Staffs come out, before the Rogues get their daggers, before Arshams are God tier, before all these things happen in Season 9, this puts Feral in an extremely strong position. We are going to be putting Feral above Rogue in S tier, and now this is just for Season 9, keep in mind. After Season 9 and later on, Season 11, Rogue probably number 1 in the game. But keep in mind, this is a Season 9 tier list, and let me tell you, I am much more afraid of a Feral than I am of a Rogue in Season 9 Arena. Up next, we have Guardian Druid. I don't even know why this is on this list. A tank Druid is not really a thing. You would not spec Bear Form Feral in Arena, so therefore it's just going to go into D. Up next, we have a Restoration Druid. Now, unfortunately to Resto Druid players across the globe, myself included, Resto Druid is pretty nerfed. It is worse than it was in Wrath, and in Wrath it was viable, strong in the right comps, but a niche healer in Wrath, and unfortunately in Cataclysm, they make so many bad changes to Resto Druid, I can't even explain it. For example, just to give you a short list, Life Bloom is only 1 target until you're in tree form, which is now a 3-minute CD. Rejuvenation is super short. Regrowth is a 5-second hot now. You super fast. If they're purging your Rejuve, you basically have no healing, because Life Bloom heals for the same numbers that it does in Cata that it did in Wrath of the Lich King. You do have Cyclone. You do actually get a 1-minute kick in your bear form. But overall, it is certainly not a super strong healer, unfortunately. All of these reasons put Resto Druid into the top of C tier. I do believe that if you were just a God tier Resto Druid with God tier teammates, you could probably go to rank 1 if you were just the best ever. If you are a mere mortal, then unfortunately this is going to be a very tough time for you as a Resto Druid player. Some comps that you could play Resto Druid with are going to be the same thing as Wrath of the Lich King. They do very well with anything that has a lot of control, i.e. God Comp would be a good pick for Resto Druid, or MLD, of course, and then even maybe LSD, but LSD is significantly worse in Cata than it is in Wrath of the Lich King. So with all that being said, Resto Druid goes into C, and we are moving on. Up next, we have another Fall from Grace. This specialization is the Elemental Shaman. Now, Elishams are insanely strong. In Wrath of the Lich King, they are probably the best caster in the game, as we all know. This changes going into Cataclysm, however, they don't fall off the truck so hard that they're just useless. Elisham is certainly viable in certain comps, seeing as it does still do a lot of burst damage if you are allowed to sit there and free cast. It still provides a lot of utility to the team, giving you Tremor Totem, giving you Grounding Totem, giving you, of course, on top of that, all the other totems like Stone Skin, Healing Stream, etc., making them a great utilitarian class. You still have Hex, you still have Knock, you still have Wind Shear, so you are strong in the right comps, but since the burst damage for Cataclysm has been overall reduced by a very large margin, even in the first season, like Season 9, Elishams no longer can just sit there, crank damage, and just randomly kill something in a Wind Shear. You actually need to have somebody already low health, and then you need to start cranking damage, and then you can potentially land a kill. There's not too much to say about Ellie Shaman, other than the fact that it is B tier, it is viable. I would put it right above Arms Warrior, and you could play this in a plethora of caster comps. However, it is difficult to play, because if the Elisham gets behind, it is very hard for them to recover, seeing as they only have Stoneclaw and, off heals, etc. So this gives them problems that just like the Boomkin faces, right? Elisham and Boomkin both suffer from a lot of the same problems. If you tunnel it and it can't cast and it can't do anything, it's kind of useless. That is the problem that you have with Elisham and Boomkin, especially in Season 9 before casters scale a bunch. Up next, we have the Enhancement Shaman. Now, Enhancement Shaman in Season 9 Cataclysm is actually way, way better than I thought it was going to be. I have played with a plethora of Enhancement Shamans, and I'm actually very surprised to see how strong they are. You do still have a short wind shear, you do still have Purge, you have many similarities between Ellie and Enhance, with a big change being that obviously Enhance is melee, Ellie is cast. Ghost Wolves do a ton of damage, and you do have Sham Rage as Enhance, which is quite a defensive. Since Ghost Wolves do a ton of damage, Wind Shear is a 5-second CD, and melees in general in Season 9 are very strong compared to casters, all of these things make Enhanced Sham pretty strong. I don't have enough experience playing with an Enhanced Sham to say which comps would be the best for you, but I know for a fact that you could play multiple comps with an Enhancement Shaman. The biggest glaring negative that Enhanced Sham has is that if you are able to kite the Enhanced Sham, let's say you're on a Fire Mage and you're getting Frost Nova'd over and over, you're getting Kona Colded, you're slowed, and you don't have somebody cleaning you, you're going to fall behind because you don't have your uptime that you need. With that being said, you are decently tanky, obviously having Stoneclaw, some off heals, Sham Rage, etc., etc. So all of these things make Shams certainly viable. I would actually be surprised if there was no rank 1 Enhanced Shams in Season 9 Cataclysm, because it is certainly a very strong specialization. For all of these reasons, it's going to go into the top of B tier for Season 9. I don't think it would remain there for later seasons, but I don't know enough to make that statement. I only know about Season 9 Cataclysm at this second, so I am going to put it where it should go, in my opinion. It has a glaring negative being able to be kited, while still having tons of damage, hex, shear, ground, etc. All of those things put it into the B tier. Up next, we have a fan favorite for melee players. We are, of course, talking about the Death Knight. Now, there is actually a lot of similarities in terms of how the Death Knight does in Cataclysm as it does in Wrath of the Lich King. In Season 9 Cataclysm, Unholy DK does a ton of damage, a huge amount of spread pressure, and it also has a ton of kicks to stop casters from casting. All of these things are very, very powerful for any kind of a comp. In early Wrath of the Lich King, DK has an insane amount of damage, and in Cataclysm, it remains the same. Season 9 DK is extremely powerful for a multitude of reasons. One of those reasons being that they now have Necrotic Strike. This ability is ridiculous because what it does is when a Death Knight Necrotic strikes you, it puts an inverse shield on your health bar. So if you had Power Word Shield on you, you would, let's say, take 25,000 damage and then you would level off and start to lose health. Necrotic Strike works the opposite way. If you get Necrotic Strike, you could be minus 10,000 health, you could get healed for 10,000 health, and your health will not move at all. On top of that, the DK is still doing damage. So you have this situation where if you have a bunch of Necrotic Strike stacks, you can literally just die because there's no way to heal you. I have personally seen so much Necrotic Strike on a Fire Mage that the Fire Mage was waiting for Cauterize, have it hit Cauterize, and the Mage just die instantly because they had over 35,000 Necrotic, 40,000 Necrotic on them. This is a very, very powerful thing, combined with the fact that they have Mind Freeze, Death Grip, Icebound Fortitude, which you can now Icebound out of a stun now, which is a huge buff, Anti-Magic Shell, Anti-Magic Zone, Gargoyle, tons of spread pressure, and tons of ways to stop a healer from casting. The only problem that DKs have in Cataclysm, which is different than Wrath of the Lich King, is that DKs actually die fairly easily now. Once you get through the DK's Lichborn healing and their Icebound Fortitude, they kind of just die in a lot of scenarios. They do have Anti-Magic Shell and Zone, but they're pretty squishy, especially if you were to compare a Wrath of the Lich King DK to a Cataclysm DK. I would argue that the Cata DK is twice as squishy as the Wrath DK. It is very hard to stay alive when you have no CDs as DK. Of course, that's why our Shams, having Earthshield and Riptide can keep you up in certain scenarios. But that is the only single glaring weakness, is that DKs get tunneled a lot, and they can die with a very short list of CDs. All of this puts DK into the top of S tier for Season 9. They are very, very strong, super good at killing healers, have a ton of pressure on any target they have, but if they do fall behind, just like Fire, just like Affliction, just like Frost, if they do start to fall behind, they kind of have to get topped really fast, and they have to change their playstyle, because they will just die. Up next, we have the Blood Death Knight. Now, at one point in Cataclysm, Blood was actually insane. Thank everything that is currently not the case in the current patch that we are playing on. Blood DK was absurd at one point in Cataclysm, however, they received a series of nerfs, making that not the case anymore. If we were to play on that broken patch where Blood DK was insane, they might even be in the A tier, I'm not sure, but since we're not playing on that patch, Blood DK goes into D for obvious reasons, seeing as it has almost no damage and is really more of a cheese spec. Up next, we have Frost. Now, Frost is definitely worse than Unholy is in Cataclysm. It does play similarly, just like it did in Wrath. Frost, you have a lot of spike damage, maybe just slightly more spike damage than an Unholy DK would have, but you don't have spread pressure like an Unholy DK would. On top of that, you are quite a bit squishier than an Unholy DK, which is already pretty squishy. They are very similar playstyle to Unholy, so we're not going to talk about Frost a bunch. They are basically just a squishier, little bit more bursty, a lot less sustained damage, and that's basically how Frost goes. All of these things put Frost into the C tier. Moving on to our next class, we have the Survival Hunter. Now, I'm going to be 100% honest with you, chat. I have never seen a Survival Hunter in an arena game, so I don't know if it's good. It's probably really bad, because I've never seen one, but I'm going to put it in D because I literally have never seen it, so I can't tell you about it because I've never even seen it. Up next, we have a very strong class. This is the Marksman Hunter, of course, that we are talking about. Marksman Hunters have a few changes with how they play, going from Wrath of the Lich King to Cataclysm. They still have Chimera Shot that hits for a pretty large amount of damage. However, their overall sustained damage is slightly less than it was in Wrath of the Lich King. On top of that, they are kind of more of a support-style class than they were previously, seeing as they have an ability where they can switch out their 5 pets mid-arena. This allows them to get an ability called Roar of Sacrifice, rolling almost constantly, which prevents the target that it's cast on from taking any critical strikes at all, which, as you can guess, is insane for a defensive CD. They also have an ability called Monkey Stun. This is a new pet that they get for Cataclysm, which is a 4-second disorient. It will simply hold a target in place when you monkey stun it, making it very easy to trap, and it is cast by the pet, of course, not by the hunter. Since you are able to dismiss pet over and over and over again, you can actually rotate your monkey stun DR on the enemy team for not only damage and landing a kill, but also defensively at the same time. At this second in time, as of filming this video, you are not able to dismiss pet over and over again to get multiple monkey stuns and multiple roars of sacrifice like you can on an old version of Cata. However, Blizzard has said that they are trying to put this into the game and fix it, quote unquote, because they can't get it to work at this second. If it does, then hunters will have that. If it doesn't, then hunters won't. You still have silencing shot, you still have deterrence, you still have scatter shot, you still have freedom, you still have a lot of damage. Hunters are very, very strong for sure. In Season 9, they crank mages. They are great at kiting. They are pretty much very similar to how they were in Wrath, minus the fact that their Mortal Strike is now a 25%, like all Mortal Strikes are. In every single class, they're all 25% now. With all that being said, if the hunters are allowed to have Dismiss Pet and constant Roars of Sacrifice and constant monkey stuns on the entire team, that would put them into the high A tier for sure. If they don't have that, that would put them into the low A tier. As far as where this goes in this tier list for Season 9, you could honestly, just from a defensive perspective, we're going to put them at the bottom of A. Because Frost can live better than a Hunter can, Affliction can live better, Fire can live better, Unholy DK can live better than a Hunter. All of these classes are very, very strong, except Marks kind of dies pretty quickly, seeing as they only have Deterrence as their major defensive, along with Roar of Sacrifice. So for that reason alone, I'm going to put them at the bottom of A. They are incredibly strong. They are a very, very powerful class, of course, and that is the reason that it's going to go into A tier at the bottom. Alright, moving up next, we have the Beast Mastery Hunter. Now, this plays very similarly to it did in Wrath of the Lich King, where it is a Bestial Wrath for 10 seconds, and that is their big go. They pop their CDs, they do a ton of damage in the opener, and they just try to squeeze as much damage as possible and get a kill as fast as they are able to. Once they are out of their Bestial Wrath, they now have way less damage than Marks, and on top of that, they have less utility because Beast Mastery Hunters don't use the Monkey Pet, so they don't have Monkey Stun. For all these reasons, there's really no reason that you would play BM over Marks unless you were trying to play a super all-in one-shot comp, and even then, Marks is probably still better. This is going to put Beast Mastery at the bottom of C tier. Up next, we have Protection Paladin. That goes in D tier. Alright, next we have Ret Paladin. Ret Paladin is a super strong class. Like, let me tell you, chat. Ret Paladins in Season 9 Cataclysm are in a very strong position for a multitude of reasons. Now remember, this is Season 9, okay? So casters, RLS, rogues are not the absolute almighty top-tier gods that they will be later on in the expansion. One of the problems that Ret Paladins have had throughout their entire history as a class is that if a Ret Paladin gets kited around the arena and they get smashed by casters just casting into them over and over again, they can just die, right? Well, that's not really a thing anymore in Cataclysm. In Season 9 at least, it is technically, but what I'm saying is you have Unstable Affliction Warlock, Fire Mage. Frost Mage has some shatter damage, yes. Boomkin has sustained damage. Ellie's sustained damage. The way that all of these classes work now is they all have a just sustained amount of damage that you are taking. One of the problems that they used to have almost is no longer relevant in Season 9 Cataclysm. Let's say you take a look at Season 8 Wrath of the Lich King. If a Ret Paladin is caught in the middle of Blade's Edge Arena and there's a Destro Lock and an Ellie casting on him, the Ret Paladin's dead. Leave the game. There's no counterplay. Queue it up. The Ret's dead. That is not the case in Season 9 Wrath of the Lich King. A couple huge changes that Ret gets in Cataclysm is, one, they are now arguably the burstiest class in the entire game for Season 9. When they use all of their holy power and pop wings with all of their CDs, it is very common to see a Ret Paladin do 60 to 70,000 damage, which is about 70% of your health, in just a few seconds to a target. They are one of the only classes in Season 9 that can do that, seeing as burst damage is really non-existent in most comps for Season 9 Cataclysm. This gives them a huge potential to one-shot a target if they line up all their damage properly, while also having Hammer of Justice and Repentance. On top of Rets having an absurd amount of burst and a high amount of damage, they still have freedom. They still have Hand of Sacrifice. They still have Blessing of Protection. They still have Divine Shield. So these are all huge things that Rets get, because in Wrath of the Lich King, Rets had a good amount of damage, but they didn't have insane damage. So now, Rets are still just as supportive as they were in Wrath, minus the fact that they don't have a defensive Dispel for your team. In terms of their survivability, I'm referring to. Like, they have the same amount of, like, utility for the most part, but they have a huge amount of damage. And now, that's just the damage side. Retribution Paladins get an ability called Word of Glory in Cataclysm. Word of Glory, if they use it when it's fully charged, heals for the most insane numbers that you could ever imagine. I have literally seen Word of Glory, an instant cast ability, no cast time. Just literally press a key and it heals whoever you want on your team. Yourself, your healer, your DPS, boom, instantly right there heals them. I have seen them hit for 83,000 when they crit. Word of Glory is an insane ability that almost lets Rets live by themselves in most situations. With the combination of the fact that Retribution Paladin has a ton of utility for the team, an insane amount of healing, and an insane amount of damage, in Season 9 specifically, they are easily one of the best classes in the game to have on your team. There is a ton of comps that you can see work with Ret Paladin. While they don't necessarily synergize with casters as much as they do with other classes, Ret DK is a terrifying comp. Ret Feral is extremely strong, and really a bunch of things. Like, it is such a like Ret is so good in Season 9. Like, it is just so strong because nobody has burst healing in Cataclysm, right? Like, if you need to get burst healed, like, it doesn't happen, right? You have to just sit there and cast and cast and cast to heal somebody up. And Retribution Paladins can literally save your healer 15,000 mana by pressing Word of Glory one time. Like, I can't stress enough how absolutely insane Retribution Paladin is in Cataclysm Season 9. Once casters start to scale up, yes, then you're going to see the problems that it did before, you know, where you have Shadow Priests can delete them and Frost Mages can delete them, etc. But since this is a Season 9 tier list, Ret is actually super strong. Retribution Paladin for sure goes into the S tier, and I don't know where in the order it would go because it's such a comp-specific class, but it is so good in Season 9. If this was Season 11, Ret would not be in the S tier, but since this is Season 9, Ret 100% belongs in the S tier. It has the highest burst in the game, along with having the most utility for your team in the game, along with having the best off heals in the game. So you literally have, like, 2 out of 3. The only problem that Ret can have is that it's not even squishy. Like, it's not even, like, all these classes die easier than a Ret Paladin does. But yes, so due to all of those reasons, Ret Paladin goes into the S tier for Season 9. It is absolutely insane, to say the least. Up next, we have a Shadow Priest. Now, Shadow Priest plays pretty similarly to it does in Wrath of the Lich King, in the fact that you still have Vampiric Touch, you still primarily do dot damage, but you do now get your Shadow Orbs, which allows you to actually do a ton of damage with Mind Spike plus Shadow Fiend. As a Shadow Priest, you still have Fade to remove slows, you still have Dispersion, you still have Silence, and you still have Coil, of course. A nice buff that Shadow Priest gets inadvertently is that Silence is always 5 seconds now. In Wrath of the Lich King, a lot of healers and a lot of classes had a reduction so that when you would silence them, instead of it being 5, it would be about 3.5 seconds. This inadvertently buffs Shadow Priests. While Shadow Priest does have a ton of extra damage, it does play the role of support just like it did in Wrath of the Lich King. One huge buff that Shadow Priest gets that no other class has in the game for Cataclysm is that a Shadow Priest can mass dispel a teammate out of a magical CC. Since they removed that, you are not allowed to get dispelled out by any other class except for Shadow Priests. This allows Shadow Priests to have a huge amount of value, especially into comps that have Polymorph, that have Ring of Frost, that have Frost Trap, that have a fourth thing. I don't know what the fourth thing would be. There's a bunch of fourth things. A Fear! A Fear! There we go. This makes Shadow Priest a very strong specialization, seeing as it provides a ton of damage, a good amount of utility, as well as having Coil, Silence, and Fear. Overall, due to all these factors, Shadow Priest is very strong, and it's going to go in the middle of A tier. I don't know exactly where you'd put it in between all of these casters. They're kind of just all the same, so all the casters are very strong. Everything in A tier is very strong, and Shadow Priest is no exception. Even in Season 9, this is a very strong class. Keep in mind, chat, when you go into later seasons, all these casters are going to move up, and Ret and Feral will probably come down. Up next, we have the Holy Priest. Now, this is a class that I actually didn't know that much about, but I have actually seen this class in Arena and played against it. It is similar to Disc in the fact that it has a good amount of healing, it is decently offensive, except it has a few differences. The two biggest differences between Disc and Holy is that Disc has Pain Suppression and Power Word Barrier, which is big damage mitigation, and Holy has neither of those. So the problem that you're going to run into as a Holy Priest is that you actually don't have a big damage mitigation cooldown. You do get Guardian Spirit, which is kind of a, oh, my guy's going to die here, I'm going to pop GA on him, and then it will, if you go below 0% health, it will heal you back up a decent amount. But that's about all you have for emergency buttons. You do use your holy words. You do get fast when you have a shield. So if you get shielded, you're very quick. It is, you know, obviously the fastest version of priest. It is much faster than disc. Disc doesn't have any kind of buffs to movement. Your holy words can actually heal for a lot. So it is certainly, I would almost argue it's viable. I don't know enough, honestly, to say at the highest level, like what comps holy would be better than disc would be. There definitely potentially could be, but I don't know enough to say that it is. For all of these reasons, I would say it's probably viable, but disc is better. It's going to go into the bottom of B tier for me personally. That's not to say that you couldn't play it, because it's not a bad spec necessarily. It's just much different than disc. Up next for the Season 9 tier list, we have the Discipline Priest. Now, the Discipline Priest has a lot of strengths that it picks up going into Cataclysm from Wrath of the Lich King. Some of those being that you have freedom every time you shield, you now get Life Grip on a 1.5-minute cooldown, and on the opposite side, there are some slight nerfs to Disc Priest as well. Disc Priest's Penance is now not healing as much as it would have comparatively to Wrath of the Lich King. In Wrath of the Lich King, if you cast Penance into a flash heal, that guy you just healed is probably full health if they have no MS. In Cataclysm, if you cast Penance into a flash heal, the guy's probably just over half if he was low when you started casting. So you're going to have to put more effort into staying ahead as this healer, which honestly is the same for all healers in Cataclysm. If a healer gets behind, they have a tough time completely recovering and healing somebody unless their DPS comes like really out of line and stops taking damage. It is very hard to deal with the constant sustained damage that a lot of compositions have in Cataclysm. Prayer of Mending still heals for a ton for Disc Priest, as well as having Renew be an extremely imperative heal that you are going to be using constantly in Arena. They have a very similar style as to what made them strong in Wrath, as to what makes them strong in Cata. There's kind of a small balance shift in how Disc Priest is played in Cataclysm as opposed to how it's played in Wrath of the Lich King. In Wrath of the Lich King, you have a pretty large amount of healing if you are able to use Penance and Free Cast, which you never really need to do because your shield is so strong and Penance is so strong. You are now required to cast Flash Heal in a lot of scenarios in Cataclysm, whereas you wouldn't do that in Wrath of the Lich King. And that's due to a multitude of factors, but the biggest ones being that Flash Heal heals for a lot and Penance doesn't heal for as much as it used to, while Grace did actually get buffed, going from 9% total healing received to 24 now. So Penance is still the best way to stack up your Grace, and Grace matters more in Cata than it did in Wrath. You also get Inner Focus, which is an Aura Mastery, which is absolutely insane. Every 45 seconds, you get a 5-second Aura Mastery, allowing you to pop Inner Focus, and on top of it being an Aura Mastery, you can also not be purged. So let's say you get some kind of a buff on you that you don't want to be purged, like, which honestly, maybe Fear Ward would be the only thing I could think of that would be like that, you know, in that situation. You can pop Inner Focus. It also gives you, of course, a chance to crit your heal. So you get Aura Mastery, you also get Freedom on your shield every 5 seconds on yourself only. You have a lot of healing, and then you have a lot of damage. So Disc Priest does a lot of damage. Disc Priest does the most damage out of every healer in the game, and it's not even close. Disc Priest will probably do 4 to 5 times the damage of an H-Pal or an R-Sham on a go. With your Shadow Fiend, your Mind Spike, your Dots, your Mind Blast, you have a ton of damage as a Disc Priest. That is the biggest strength that Disc Priest has, which makes RMP even stronger on a go, because if you have the Disc Priest casting damage, you have a Frost Mage casting damage, and you have a Rogue using Shadow Dance, and then you bomb the kill target, that guy's probably just dead. With all of that being said, Disc Priest is not the best healer in Cataclysm for sure, but it is a strong healer nonetheless in the right compositions. For these reasons, Disc Priest definitely goes into the A tier. I don't really care where you put it in A tier. We could put it at the bottom if you want. It is definitely very strong in the right compositions, and it has some very strong matchups, and it is all, especially, keep in mind, this is a Season 9 tier list. In Season 9, Disc Priest is actually much tankier than it was in comparatively Season 5 Wrath of the Lich King. And of course, Desperate Prayer is also massively buffed. And that concludes the Disc Priest. Up next, we have the Holy Paladin. Now, this class takes a big nerf compared to how it was in Wrath of the Lich King, while still being very strong and having good comps, just like a Disc Priest does. Holy Paladins have a very similar playstyle to Wrath of the Lich King in terms of how, like, the comps that attract them is what I'm trying to say. So, anything that has a lot of damage, anything that, you want to all-in a team, a Holy Pally is probably going to be your best healer for that. They have a ton of instant healing, they have a ton of healing in general, but if you do manage to get their trinket, and you manage to get their bubble, just like in Wrath, they don't really have any healing over time effects. And the only thing they have, to my knowledge, is Illuminated Healing, which is purgeable. You just take it right off and they just die. So that's one of the only glaring weaknesses that HPAL has, is that it doesn't have healing over time effects like Disc Priest does with Prayer Mending and Renew and Grace Stacks to cover, and Arsham with Riptide and, Unleash Elements and blah, 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 Earth Living and all their million hots and Healing Stream. But nonetheless, that doesn't mean that HPAL is bad. HPAL is a very, very strong healer. There's not too much to say about it. It is worse than it was in Wrath, but still very good. Holy Paladin, for those reasons, goes into A. You could put it anywhere. I really don't care where it would go. You could put it right above Disc. Let's do that. They're like this. They're both like Holy Pally and Disc. Both have comps that like they would be better in. That's the way that I think of Holy Pally and Disc. Like obviously, like RMP is better with Disc Priest, and then like a Cleave is going to be better with HPAL in most situations. But both healers are very strong in the right situation. Moving on to the infamous healer in Cataclysm, of course we are now talking about the Restoration Shaman. This class gets a whole bunch of buffs going into Cataclysm. For example, they now have Spirit Link Totem, which is very, very strong. They also get Spirit Walker's Grace, which is an ability that allows them to cast while moving. This lets them kite away while still dumping healing surges in a situation where they're trying to run away. They still have Ghost Wolf, of course, so they have great mobility. They have all their totems. They have a bunch of healing over time effects. And they honestly have more healing over time effects now than they did compared to in Wrath of the Lich King. One of the reasons for that is that in Wrath of the Lich King, so many comps had such a spiky amount of damage that Resto Shaman couldn't really deal with it. But in Cataclysm, since a lot less comps have a lot less spiky damage, Resto Shaman is inadvertently buffed because the way that Resto Shaman heals is really good into sustained damage, and if you combine a lot of these classes, a lot of them are just going to do sustained damage. Of course, they heal a lot when people are low health. They have Earth Shield, they have Riptide, they have Unleash Elements, they have Earth Living, they have Healing Stream Totem. They have so many passive heals. They are the undisputed king of passive healing. This makes them really good into any kind of a spell cleave, MLS, Shatter, God Comp, any kind of a comp that has a wizard. They are going to do great into. They have grounding, they have shear, they have a ton of different things. With all of that being said, in Season 9, they do have one glaring weakness. And I personally was actually surprised because I was unaware until recently at how poor Arshams are at living when they are getting tunneled by melees. Yes, Resto Shamans have Riptide, Earth Shield, Healing Stream, Earth Living, all these things that keep them alive for a very long time. But one glaring weakness they have is if you have two melees sitting on the Resto Shaman, and nobody is able to help the Resto Shaman, and your Riptide is getting purged, and they're just sitting there and just cranking damage into you, you do not have enough healing without casting Healing Surge to stay alive. This is why they have Spirit Walkers, of course, but if you pop Spirit Walkers and you're in Chains of Ice, it's useless anyway. So the only major weakness that Arsham has, and in my opinion is good that they have this weakness, because if Arshams didn't have this weakness, they would be S++++. They would just be an HPAL that's better, a priest that's better, who cares, is that Arshams die fairly easily to melees, especially in Season 9. It is not uncommon for your Arsham to get opened on in a situation and have them die within 30 seconds because the rogue will simply smoke bomb their Spirit Link, or the Spirit Link will get sniped, or they'll get strangulated at a bad time, etc., etc. With that being said, that is their only major weakness. The only other thing I could say about Arsham is that it doesn't really do a lot of damage. You do have Purge, you do have Shear, you do have Ground, which are all triple great offensive abilities, but they don't do any damage. So if you cast Lightning Bolt, you cast Lava Burst, it's going to do almost no damage compared to a Disc Priest, or obviously any other actual damage class. So you really can't help that much with damage, but that doesn't really matter because you have so much sustained healing that you are such an insane healer. Pairing that with Hex and the rest of your utility, Arsham obviously goes into the S tier. I don't really care where it would go into S tier. It's the best healer. We'll just put it, the healers are on the bottom. We'll put it on the bottom, whatever. So Arsham, S tier healer for sure. It's the best healer, even in Season 9, before spell cleaves get out of control. And after spell cleaves get out of control, then Arsham becomes even better because now they have more resil, they have more health, they have more healing, the casters have more damage, they have more counter pressure. But even with all of that, Arsham is so strong, it is definitely an S tier healer for all of these reasons. And this is the final tier list for Season 9 Cataclysm. Of course, this could be subjective. You could change a little things here and there. There are certain comps where you could say Ret is not S. There are certain comps where you could say DK is S. There are certain times where you could say all kinds of stuff is different. But anything B and above should be rank 1 viable, with the exception, I think Holy Priest might be. But anything B plus is all rank 1 viable. So as you can see, there is tons of different classes and specs that you are able to play in Cataclysm, making it hopefully a fairly diverse expansion in terms of what is going to queue into the ladder. This is for Season 9, keep in mind, not Season 10, not Season 11. If this was a Season 10 plus tier list, a lot of these would shift by a pretty large margin. That is the end of this video. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you guys in Cataclysm.